An old photograph can hold 1,000 words that were never spoken. And sometimes, when the right person holds it at the right moment, it can stop time itself. On a Tuesday night in 1979, inside Studio 6B at NBC Burbank, something happened that would redefine what it meant to be human on live television. Johnny Carson, the man who had perfected the art of never breaking character, stood frozen center stage. In his hands, a black and white photograph. Behind him, Doc Severinsen's band had gone completely silent. The audience, nearly 400 people, sat paralyzed. No one moved. No one breathed. And America, watching from 40 million living rooms, had no idea what they were about to witness. The photograph was small, weathered at the edges, the kind that had been carried in a wallet for decades. Carson's face had drained of color. His trademark smile, the one that had opened every show for 17 years, was gone. Ed McMahon leaned forward from his chair, concern washing over his usually jovial expression. The woman who had handed Carson the photo stood beside him, trembling, tears streaming down her face. She wasn't supposed to be on stage. Security had tried to stop her. But Carson had waved them off. And now, holding that photograph, he understood why she had risked everything to reach him. This wasn't just a moment of television. It was a moment when the mask came off, when the joke stopped, and when one man's humanity eclipsed an entire industry built on entertainment. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. It had started like any other Tuesday taping. Carson arrived at the studio around 4:30 p.m., his routine unchanged since 1962. He walked through the backstage corridors with a styrofoam cup of coffee, exchanging brief nods with crew members who had worked with him for years. In his dressing room, he reviewed cue cards for the monologue, made notes in the margins with a blue ballpoint pen, and adjusted his tie in the mirror. The tie was navy with thin silver stripes. He always chose his ties carefully. They were the only splash of personality he allowed himself in a sea of neutral suits. By 5:30 p.m., the audience had filled the studio. Tourists from Ohio, college students from UCLA, a retired couple from Nebraska celebrating their 40th anniversary. Among them sat Margaret Holloway, a 52-year-old elementary school teacher from Sacramento. She had driven 3 hours to be there. In her purse, wrapped in tissue paper, was the photograph. She had carried it every day for 11 years. 11 years of waiting for the right moment. 11 years of hoping she might somehow, someday, find a way to thank the man who had saved her son's life without ever knowing it. The show opened at 5:30 p.m. sharp. The familiar theme music filled the studio. Ed McMahon's booming voice. From Hollywood, it's The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson. The curtain parted. Carson walked out with that signature swing in his step, waving to the crowd, his smile perfectly calibrated. He delivered his monologue with surgical precision. Jokes about Congress, about the weather, about a new diet fad sweeping the nation. The audience laughed on cue. Everything was going exactly as it always did. Then came the desk segment. Carson sat down, shuffled some papers, sipped from his coffee mug, which actually contained tea. He began reading viewer mail, a regular feature where he'd respond to letters with improvised humor. Most were innocuous. Compliments, jokes, the occasional complaint about a guest from 3 weeks ago. But then he picked up an envelope that had been flagged by a producer. Inside was a note, handwritten in shaky cursive. Mr. Carson, I need to thank you. You saved my son. Please, if you read this on air, I'll be in the audience tonight. Row F, seat 12. I just need 1 minute. Carson paused. He reread the note silently. His eyes scanned the audience until they landed on row F. There she was. Margaret Holloway. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap. Her eyes were locked on his. Something in her expression told him this wasn't a prank, wasn't a publicity stunt. This was real. He set down the cue card, looked directly at her, and did something he almost never did. He broke protocol. Carson stopped mid-segment. The entire studio froze. Ma'am, Carson said, his voice quieter than usual. Are you the one who wrote this? Margaret nodded, unable to speak. Carson stood up from his desk. The audience murmured in confusion. Ed McMahon glanced at the producers in the booth, but no one moved to stop it. Carson walked to the edge of the stage, extended his hand toward Margaret, and said, "Come up here. Please." Security hesitated. Audience members weren't supposed to go on stage. It was a liability issue, a safety concern, a disruption to the taping schedule. But Carson's assistant director, a man who had worked with him since the show's inception, made a split-second decision. He nodded to the guards. "Let her through." Margaret Holloway rose from her seat on shaking legs. The audience parted as she walked down the aisle. Someone helped her up the steps to the stage. And there she stood, face to face with Johnny Carson, the man she had watched every night for over a decade, the man whose voice had been a constant in the darkest period of her life. Carson didn't rush her. He didn't make a joke to ease the tension. He simply waited. Margaret reached into her purse with trembling hands and pulled out the photograph. She handed it to Carson without a word. He took it carefully, as if it were made of glass. And when he looked down at the image, everything stopped. The photograph showed a young boy, maybe 10 years old, lying in a hospital bed. He was painfully thin, his head wrapped in bandages, and four attached to his small arm. But he was smiling. And on the table beside him sat a small black and white television. On the screen, blurry but unmistakable, was Johnny Carson's face. Carson stared at the photo for what felt like an eternity. His jaw tightened. His eyes began to glisten under the stage lights. When he finally looked up at Margaret, his voice cracked. "Tell me about him." Margaret's voice was barely a whisper, but the microphones caught every word. "His name was Daniel. He was my son. He had a brain tumor. The doctors gave him 6 months. That was in 1968. He was 10 years old. And every night, Mr. Carson, every single night, we would turn on your show. Even when he was too weak to speak, even when the pain was unbearable, he would smile when you came on. You made him laugh. You gave him something to look forward to. You gave us both something to hold on to." Carson's hand was still holding the photograph. His thumb traced the edge of it gently, as if trying to reach through time and touch the boy in the image. "Did he?" Carson couldn't finish the sentence. Margaret shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "He passed away 3 weeks after that photo was taken. But Mr. Carson, those last 3 weeks, because of you, he laughed. He wasn't just a sick kid in a hospital. For 90 minutes every night, he was just a kid watching TV with his mom. You gave us that. You gave us normal. And I've carried this photo every day since, waiting for the chance to say thank you." The studio was silent. Not the polite silence of an audience waiting for the next joke. This was the silence of collective heartbreak. Doc Severinsen, known for his flamboyant jackets and upbeat demeanor, had his head bowed. Ed McMahon's eyes were red. Camera operators who had filmed thousands of hours of comedy found themselves wiping their faces with their sleeves. Backstage, the production team had made a choice no producer would have ever allowed. They kept the cameras rolling. Carson looked down at the photograph again. He held it with both hands now, as if it were the most precious thing in the world. When he spoke, his voice was raw, stripped of all performance. "I don't know what to say. I've told 10,000 jokes on this stage. I've interviewed presidents and movie stars and musicians. But this... Margaret, I didn't save your son. You did. You were there. You held his hand. You made him feel loved every single day. All I did was tell some jokes." Margaret reached out and touched Carson's arm. "Mr. Carson, you'll never understand what you meant to us. To so many of us. You weren't just entertainment. You were family. You were the voice that made us feel less alone." Carson nodded slowly. He carefully folded the photograph and handed it back to her. But Margaret shook her head. "Keep it," she said. "I don't need it anymore. I just needed you to see him. I needed you to know that what you do matters. That it's not just jokes and interviews. It's hope. It's connection. It's love. Carson took the photograph back. He looked at it one more time, then slipped it into the inside pocket of his suit jacket, right over his heart. He turned to Margaret, and in a moment that no script could have written, he embraced her. Not a quick, polite hug for the cameras. A real embrace. The kind you give someone when words are no longer enough. The audience rose to their feet. The applause started slowly, then built into a roar. It wasn't applause for entertainment. It was applause for humanity. For vulnerability. For the rare, beautiful moment when the walls between performer and audience, between celebrity and human being, completely dissolved. Carson walked Margaret back to her seat himself. He didn't hand her off to a stagehand. He escorted her down the steps, through the aisle, back to row F, seat 12. He squeezed her hand one more time before returning to the stage. When he sat back down at his desk, he didn't immediately resume the show. He sat there for a moment, collecting himself. Ed McMahon didn't say anything. The band didn't play. The audience waited. And then Carson looked directly into the camera, into the homes of 40 million Americans, and said something he had never said before on air. Sometimes this job makes you forget why you started. You get caught up in the ratings, the guests, the schedule. But every once in a while, something happens that reminds you what it's really about. It's about connection. It's about being there for people when they need something to hold on to. Margaret, thank you for reminding me. Thank you for reminding all of us. He paused, took a breath, and with a slight smile added, "We'll be right back." The commercial break was unusually long. Backstage, Carson stood alone in the hallway, his back against the wall, the photograph still in his pocket. His assistant director approached cautiously. "Johnny, are you okay?" Carson nodded. "Yeah. I needed a minute. That was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen on this show." Carson looked up. "Don't cut it. Air it exactly as it happened. Are you sure? It's not typical content. I'm sure. People need to see this. I need people to see this." But this was the moment no one in the studio, nor anyone at home, ever saw coming. The episode aired 3 nights later. NBC executives had debated whether to include the Margaret Holloway segment. It was emotional, unscripted, and completely off-brand for a late-night comedy show. But Carson had insisted. And Johnny Carson didn't insist on many things. The response was unprecedented. The network received over 50,000 letters in the first week alone. People shared their own stories of loss, of finding comfort in Carson's voice during difficult times. Teachers wrote about students who had found hope. Nurses wrote about patients who asked for the TV to be turned to Carson's show, even in their final hours. The photograph of Daniel Holloway, the boy who had smiled through unimaginable pain, became a symbol. Not of tragedy, but of the power of human connection. Carson never spoke publicly about that night again. But those who worked with him noticed a change. He was gentler with guests. More patient with audience members who asked unusual questions. He kept Margaret's photograph in his dressing room, in a small frame on his desk, next to a picture of his own sons. And on particularly difficult days, when the grind of daily television felt exhausting, he would look at that photo and remember why he showed up. Years later, after Carson retired in 1992, Margaret Holloway was invited to his final taping. She sat in the same seat. Row F, seat 12. When Carson delivered his closing monologue, thanking America for 30 years of late-night companionship, he paused. His eyes found Margaret in the audience. He touched his chest, right where the photograph had been that night in 1979. She understood. She touched her chest in return. No words needed. The photograph itself became part of television history. After Carson's death in 2005, his estate donated personal items to the Paley Center for Media. Among them was the photo of Daniel Holloway. It now sits in a climate-controlled case, alongside Emmy Awards and vintage cue cards, a reminder that the most important moments in entertainment are often the ones that have nothing to do with entertainment at all. Margaret Holloway passed away in 2018 at the age of 91. In her obituary, her family mentioned that she had met Johnny Carson once, and that it had been one of the greatest moments of her life. They included a copy of the photograph. Daniel, smiling in his hospital bed, Carson's face flickering on that tiny television screen. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. Because sometimes, the greatest performances aren't scripted. They're simply human. And on that Tuesday night in 1979, Johnny Carson reminded an entire nation that behind every joke, every smile, every late-night laugh, there's something far more powerful, the simple act of showing up for people when they need it most. The photograph still sits in that museum case today. A reminder that television, at its best, isn't about entertainment. It's about connection. And Johnny Carson understood that better than anyone who ever held a microphone.